Hi, so I thought this week, just to vary things a little bit, I'd do your work via video. So I'm going to try and do this all in one take. This will be a lot quicker, so apologies if it's all a bit kind of cut up. So first of all, thank you for everyone who sent me all the work over the last couple of weeks. Very odd circumstances, aren't they? So hopefully everyone's getting used to that. Obviously there's still a few of you who haven't sent me work. I can't emphasize enough how important it is that you send me the work over these few weeks. It's quite likely to be one of the things that Ofqual ask all the teachers to use when creating your predicted grades. So if you don't complete the work, you really are risking getting a lower predicted grade. Anyway, so hopefully the work I've set so far has been reasonably straightforward. So what I'm going to do is set you the forestry stuff, just talk through a little bit of it. So if you could get your forestry notes out, the work you did last week, I'll recap a little bit of that. And then I'll set you your work for this week as well. So if you want to still pause at any point to go and grab your stuff, then not a bad idea. Alright, so last week I set you some stuff on sort of plantations. Well, initially traditional forest management, things like coppicing. Now we did coppicing quite a bit last year, so hopefully that was just a bit of a recap really, and hopefully you've taken away from that the idea that it's very good for biodiversity. I'm not going to go through all the reasons why we did do that last year. For the exam, because of course some of you may end up wanting to sit the exam in the autumn or possibly the following summer, you do really need to know some really specific details. So the names of different plants, for example, you might get at different stages in the coppicing cycle. Ones that like shade, like sort of ferns, and ones that require more light. So again, the devil is in the detail. Also, last week I asked you to make some notes on why forests are important, and again it's really important you've got specific examples. So rather than just saying medicines, e.g. the rosy periwinkle plant, you should say things like medicines, e.g. the rosy periwinkle plant produces vincristine that's used to treat childhood leukemia. So you need to be really, really precise and really, really detailed. Now plantations, hopefully you've kind of taken from that they're generally pretty bad for biodiversity, quite productive, close planting, trees all the same age, often non-native species, and often planted very close together. Now there's a reason that you plant the trees close together. It's actually to stop branches lower down. Where you have a branch in the main trunk, you have what's called a knot, which is a weakness in the piece of wood, so it reduces the value of the wood. So lots and lots of reasons why you have plantations. I say very productive, often fast growing non-native trees, often fertilizers used, etc, etc. Close planting, but pretty low for biodiversity. Now that's not all bad. There are some positives of plantations, so hopefully you've made some notes on those. Of course you can have plantations in tropical countries, for example, and those plantations might be a way of providing things like mahogany and teak rather than getting the mahogany and teak from deforesting rainforest. The problem, of course, is often the best place for a plantation is where your rainforest is. So if you're clearing rainforest to create a plantation, a monoculture, obviously that's not good for biodiversity. There's a variation in plantations as well. I remember some plantations, if you have mixed species and they tend to be more native species, then that's better for biodiversity. Hopefully watch that video Going Bush, a bit of an unusual name in Australia, and that contrasted those two different types of plantations. Now there's one more exercise you could have a go at in your booklets, and it's really the idea of managing different forests for different reasons. It's on page 21 and you've got a blank table, and it's a bit faint, but you've got some headings. You've got the timber production, so in other words managing a forest purely for timber production in the first column. In the next column you've got managing a forest purely for nature, for conservation, and in the last column you've got if you were managing a forest purely for sort of recreational reasons, mountain biking, walking, things like that. Down the left hand side you've got some different criteria: tree species, tree age, planting density, etc. Now the table's not complete, so you could have a go at trying to complete that in pencil, and then the answers you will find in your booklet on page 29, but it'd be good to try and do it without looking at that first, and I say you can use the table on page 29 to check your answers. So that would be quite a nice way of sort of finishing off some of the stuff that you were looking at last week. Now the last part of the forestry syllabus, sorry, just log on, keep getting logged off here. The last part of the forestry syllabus is on deforestation, so why we lose trees, and finally what can be done to sort of reduce that process. So probably a good thing for your notes would be to put a title, deforestation, and it's quite nice to split the two main causes of deforestation into two categories. One is clearance above the MSY. So if you're removing trees for timber, for example, but if you're removing them faster than the rate they can regrow or be replanted, then that's effectively deforestation. Now, there's quite a nice PowerPoint on the Moodle site which you could have a look at, which is called Forests and MSY. So I recommend you having a read through that and making some brief notes. We have talked about maximum sustainable yield when we did fisheries, but you do need to note for forestry as well. The other reason for deforestation is clearance for other uses. So as I say, you could split your page, title deforestation, you have the above the MSY on one side of the page, the other side you could have clearance for other uses, and then you could make some notes on the reasons why forests are cleared for other uses, things like mining, HEP schemes. There are quite a few. Your textbook does it very, very well. On, let's just have a look, it's around page 368, so that's done quite well in your textbook. It's also done quite well in the old textbook as well, around page 270, 276, 277, around that kind of area. So that would be quite a good thing to start off with. And then once you've done that, I would recommend doing a spider diagram. If you've got A3 paper, that would be great. If you haven't, do it on A4. And this is the impacts of deforestation. So you've got the reasons for it and then the impacts. Now the impacts split quite nicely into some different categories. You've got things like impacts on the loss of forest resources. So which resources will you no longer be able to get because you've removed the forest. The next category is ecological impacts, impacts on species. Hydrological impacts, so that's impacts on the water cycle. Impacts on soil, so things like soil erosion, and then finally impacts on climate and microclimate. So there's about sort of 6 different categories there. So that would be a really nice way of compiling your notes on an A3 spider diagram. Don't have to do it that way, but I think that would work quite well. That's on page 368 and 369 in your new textbook. There's also, again, some quite good stuff in the old textbook as well. And there's also, in fact, quite a nice PowerPoint on the Moodle site called Deforestation Examples and Facts and Figures. Alright, so you can have a look through that. Now, in your resource booklet there are quite a lot of nice articles which I'd recommend you having a read of. There is quite a nice one on something called ash dieback, which you might have heard of. We have more problems with invasive species, don't we? And often invasive species bring diseases with them. Ash dieback is a very good example. So that's a reason for forest loss. That's on page 25. If you wanted to have a read through, have a look at some of the model exam questions. That would be quite good. And then a little bit further on, there's quite a nice article about whether or not we should sell our national forests. That's on page 31. So the Forestry Commission is actually a government organisation, and it's actually the biggest landowner in the UK. There was an idea a few years ago to maybe perhaps sell off those plantations and sell off the forests owned by the government, by the Forestry Commission, to private individuals. Whether you should or shouldn't do that, that's worth a read again when you get a chance. So a little bit further on, there's actually quite a nice exam question about the impacts of plantations, coniferous plantations, on species. Again, this is sort of more relevant, I suppose, to the stuff you were doing last week. It's on page 34, 35, right through to page 37. It's June 2016, so the mark scheme should be on the Moodle site. One of the issues of plantations is often they can acidify soil. Pine trees are also quite good at scavenging acidic pollutants from the atmosphere. The needles themselves, as they break down, can be quite acidic, and so they can affect the pH of nearby streams and rivers. There's also quite a nice stats question within that. So again, that would be quite a good one to do when you get a chance. And you can obviously, actually goes on to page 38. You can again take a picture of that, and I can check that you've done that. Page 39, there's quite a nice article, Tropical Deforestation. Again, this is about sort of why forests are cleared and some of the impacts. Again, well worth a look when you get a chance. And then further on, page 42, June 2010, there's a question about deforestation. And then we're starting now to come into some of the ways we can be more sustainable and stop deforestation. So you could do that one on page 42, but before you go much further, I would finish off then your notes as a last topic, as a last title, because this is the end of the forestry module. Put a title: Sustainable Forest Management. Again, I think this works really well as a spider diagram, and there's some really good notes in your textbook. Again, it starts on page 369. It's a relatively small section. It's actually done slightly better, I think, in the old textbook, page 277 through to 278, I think it is, something like that. You need to have a look, but it's covered very well there. So again, if you can make some notes on ways in which forests can be managed more sustainably. I'll give you a few examples just to get you started. Things like ecotourism, for example, is one way of incentivizing people not to clear the forest if they can see they can have a job, maybe as a guide. Things like, for example, debt for nature swaps. What else have we got here? Making sure if you are clearing forests, you do it below the MSY. Listing rare timbers on CITES. Agroforestry, so for example growing coffee underneath the canopy rather than clearing the forest for coffee plantations. So just lots of examples of how we can manage forests more sustainably, or how we can reduce deforestation. Things like the Forest Stewardship Council stamp you get on timber, this FSC stamp, which you know if you buy that timber it's come from a sustainable source. So again, you could create that as a sort of nice spider diagram. So that would be good. There are some quite nice videos. There's a nice video about ecotourism in Costa Rica on the Moodle site. I'm just having a look at now. So that would be quite good to do as well. So once you've done that, you are pretty much there. So as I say, you could finish off that question 5b on page 42 about how the exploitation of timber could be made more sustainable. And again, there's a couple more articles you could have a look through. There's quite a nice one on page 49, Managing Tropical Rainforests in a More Sustainable Way. That's quite good. Talks about things like biosphere reserves, which is the top right of page 51, so sort of designating and protecting tropical forests. And then lastly, there's quite a nice question right at the end of your booklet, page 54. This looks like it's back to front, page 53 and then 54, which is June 2015. That would be quite a good one to do as well. And then I think pretty much, guys, you're done. That's it for forestry. So all you've got left on that part of the syllabus, you've got farming, fishing, forestry. The last bit is a bit about sustainability, which I'll set you some work on that next week. But that's it for forestry for this week. Hopefully that makes sense. Any questions, obviously, just drop me an email. Okay.